Story 1. A pirate known as Jean Lafitte had a bounty of $500 placed on him by a governor. He then placed a bounty of $5,000 on the governor. Story 2. When Otto von Bismarck was about 50, a man ran up to him on the street and shot him 5 times. Bismarck turned and beat the attacker until armed guards arrived. When the guards inspected him, they found that all 5 shots had hit him, but each either grazed him or bounced off his ribs. He became known as the Iron Chancellor. Story 3. Morocco was the first country to recognize the independence of the United States. It had a treaty with England that prohibited tolerating or engaging in piracy against English ships. No such prohibition applied to American shipping. Story 4. The Australians stole a tank from no man's land in World War I because they could. Story 5. Napoleon invited his brother-in-law to speak with him before his coronation as emperor to remind him that he had earlier objected to Napoleon's marriage to Josephine, believing Napoleon would amount to nothing. Story 6. When France exiled Napoleon Bonaparte the first time, they did not replace military personnel. He went to the first French outpost he reached, greeted them informally, and began reassembling an army. By the time he reached Paris, he had gathered enough forces that France welcomed him back. Story 7. In the 1970s, the small town of Vulcan, West Virginia, asked for state funding to replace the bridge leading into town. The state legislature refused to grant Vulcan the funding it needed. Instead, the town appealed to the Soviet Union for aid. After hearing about the request, the state legislature immediately granted over $1 million for the town to build a new bridge. If a small town in West Virginia asking for Soviet funding in the middle of the Cold War is not a bold rebuke to the state government, then I do not know what is. Story 8. A British prisoner of war in National Socialist Germany stitched a quilt. The National Socialists displayed it. Hidden in the Morse code stitching were the words "Fuck Hitler" and "God Save the King." Edit. I think I just had the "God Save the Queen" song stuck in my head. Story 9. Some background is required. The Spartans were famously laconic. They were trained to get to the point when speaking instead of using ornate language, by being bitten on the thumb if they became long-winded. Now to the meat of the story. Philip II of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, sent the Spartans a letter asking, "Would you like me to enter your land as friend or foe?" The Spartans replied with one word, "Neither." Philip was incensed and sent another long-winded message. "If once I enter into your territories, I will destroy you all, never to rise again." The Spartans answered with one word, "If." It was like putting your head in a lion's mouth. Story 10. After the Restoration, the English dug up the body of Oliver Cromwell, hanged, drawn, and quartered it, and placed his head on London Bridge. Story 11. I would say the moment that Rollo swore allegiance to the French king was when the bishop's present suggested that Rollo kiss the king's foot as a sign of submission. It was probably an idea intended to humiliate Rollo and was not taken very well. After some discussion, it was agreed that one of Rollo's men would do it. However, the man chosen lifted the king's foot and, without bending down, brought it to his mouth. Not surprisingly, the king fell over amid general laughter in the court. Following this amusing scene, the king and his men swore to honor the concession to Rollo. Story 12. This is already one of my favorite threads in Reddit history. Galvarino was a Chilean warrior who had both his hands cut off by the conquistadors for raising his arms against the Spanish. Instead of allowing himself to serve as a message of helplessness in the face of the invaders, he strapped swords to his stumps and went on the warpath. Story 13. The first cell phone call ever made was to a competitor's landline. Big dick energy. Story 14. At his coronation, King Henry VII backdated his reign to before the Battle of Bosworth. So anyone who was loyal to him then but had earlier shown any sign of opposition at Bosworth became a traitor and an enemy of the realm. Justice served. Story 15. This is a minor point, but when Taft bragged to his friends in a telegram about scaling a mountain on horseback, saying it was a few thousand feet, with clear weather and not too difficult, his friend replied, "How is the horse?" Story 16. In the late 1980s, Nintendo and Sony developed a compact disc add-on for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Nintendo then withdrew from the partnership and chose to work with Philips, which resulted in the compact disc interactive device. Many criticized Nintendo for abandoning a domestic partner in favor of a foreign company. Sony continued the project and attempted to partner with Sega, but Sega's board of directors rejected the idea, saying Sony lacked experience making hardware and software. In 1994, Sony released the PlayStation to compete with the Nintendo 64. It outsold Nintendo's console by nearly 3-1 and marked the first time Nintendo was not the industry leader since the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Story 17. When Germanic tribes invaded Britain after the Romans left, they named the native Celts Welsh, meaning foreigner, although they were the invaders. That later became the word Welsh, which the English promptly adopted for phrases like Welch on a bet. In short, all of history has been one giant etymological middle finger to the Welsh. Story 18. Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7 was played in besieged Leningrad and broadcast on the radio so Nazi soldiers could hear it. Imagine hearing "fuck you" from a city you thought was already dead. Story 19. The reply of the Zaporozhian Cossacks is the best response to a demand for surrender ever. In response to requests by the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to desist from attacks and submit, Zaporozhian Cossacks to the Turkish Sultan, "O Sultan, Turkish devil and damned kith and kin of the devil," secretary to Lucifer himself. "What kind of devilish knight are you, who cannot slay a hedgehog with your naked arse? The devil shits and your army eats. You shall not, you son of a whore, make subjects of Christian sons. We have no fear of your army. By land and by sea we will battle with you. Fuck your mother. You Babylonian scullion, Macedonian wheelwright, brewer of Jerusalem, goatfucker of Alexandria, swineherd of Greater and Lesser Egypt, pig of Armenia, Podolian thief, catamite of Tartary, hangman of camionettes, and fool of all the world and underworld, an idiot before God, grandson of the serpent, and the crick in our dick. Pig snout, mare's arse, slaughterhouse cur, unchristened brow, screw your own mother. So the Zaporozhians declare you lowlife. You will not even be herding pigs for the Christians. Now we will conclude, for we do not know the date and do not own a calendar. The moon is in the sky, the year is with the Lord, the day is the same over here as it is over there. For this kiss our arse. Kashovii Otoman Ivan Serko, with the whole Zaporozhian host. Story 20. My personal favorite is the beginning of the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England, 1066. England has been invaded by a Norwegian army led by Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, and Tostig Godwinson, an exiled English earl and estranged brother of the English king. They have already fought one battle and captured York. Things are looking good for them. They are celebrating their success, waiting at Stamford Bridge for the hostages they demanded. It is a hot day and they are not expecting trouble. Then an English army appears. That is practically impossible. The Battle of Fulford had taken place only 5 days earlier, and the Norwegians had routed the forces of the Northern Earls. The rest of the English army was supposed to be in the south, awaiting a Norman invasion. It turns out the English had marched all the way north in 4 days. The Norwegians, understandably unhappy, form a shield circle. They do not have their armor with them. It is at the ships. It is too hot to stand around in mail. They have helmets, shields, and weapons, and that is it. The English send a rider to negotiate. He tells Tostig that his brother, the king, is willing to offer him his earldom back and part of the rule of England if he gives up now. Tostig asks what Harald Hardrada would get. The rider replies, 6 feet of English ground, or as much more as he needs, being taller than other men. Tostig says they are done here, and the rider rides away. Harald Hardrada asks who the rider was, because if it had been him speaking he would have killed the man then and there. Tostig says, "Oh, that was my brother. That is Harald Godwinson, the king." Harald Godwinson rode up to an enemy camp personally and told the king of Norway, a renowned warrior and general, that all he would get from this invasion was a grave. Battle commences. The Norwegians lose. Tostig and Harald Hardrada both die in a huge, bloody melee. The English army is exhausted. 3 days later, the Normans land in the south. Harold is in a terrible position. He marches his army back, gathers what forces he can, and fights 3 weeks later at Hastings, where he is killed and the Normans conquer England. It is a very personal, defiant moment that snowballs into a national catastrophe. Edit, because many people ask, yes, this is the battle with the legendary berserker at the bridge. No, that episode probably did not actually happen. The story appears hundreds of years later and is inconsistent. There may not even have been a bridge there at the time. Story 21. More weight. Story 22. Stop sending people to kill me. We have already captured 5 of them, one with a bomb and another with a rifle. If you do not stop sending killers, I will send a very fast-acting one to Moscow, and I certainly will not have to send another. Tito to Joseph Stalin. Story 23. I'm not a historian, but I know this World War I fact. In 1918, during the Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, Major James Robertson planned to recover a German tank stuck in no man's land. There was little point in taking it, it was dangerous and the tank posed no threat. Nevertheless, he assembled 12 men and retrieved the tank under machine gun fire and in mustard gas, apparently to taunt the German army. Thanks to him and the others, that tank is the only original World War I tank we have today. It is called Mephisto. Story 24. Not the biggest, probably, but the first that came to mind. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe responded to the National Socialist German Workers' Party demand that Bastogne surrender with the single word nuts. Story 25. Olga of Kiev. When her husband died, the country that killed him assumed they could take over and force her into marriage. She killed the dignitaries sent to tell her she had to marry. She then traveled to the place where her husband had been killed and burned it to the ground. She was later canonized as a saint. Story 26. The Werwolf was supposedly the largest trebuchet ever built. When disassembled, it filled 30 wagons. King Edward I built it to besiege a Scottish castle. Before it was completed, the Scots offered to surrender. Edward replied, "You do not deserve any grace. You must surrender to my will." He had the trebuchet built in 40 days and proceeded to use it. Story 27. The second defenestration of Prague occurred when representatives of the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia were sent to the Protestant city of Prague to demand conversion to Catholicism. The representatives were thrown out of a window and allegedly landed in a pile of manure. Story 28. Ferruccio Lamborghini was a wealthy man who owned a company that built tractors. He spoke to Ferrari about imperfections in his car and how to improve them, but they laughed at a young tractor mechanic trying to tell them about sports cars. He decided to start making luxury sports cars to compete with Ferrari, and the rivalry was born. So I'd say this was a clear rebuke to Ferrari. Story 29. On September 30th, 1938, the Munich Agreement was signed, resulting in Germany's annexation of the Sudetenland, a region of western Czechoslovakia with a large ethnic German population. The agreement was signed by the leaders of the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and Germany. The United Kingdom and France agreed because Hitler promised not to start a war if he received the Sudetenland, a promise that was later broken. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the meeting about its own territory, despite France being its ally at the time. Story 30. Not the biggest, but definitely one to note. In 1966, Charles de Gaulle ordered all United States troops out of France and said the country was leaving the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Lyndon B. Johnson's first words to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, were, "Ask him about the cemeteries, Dean." When Dean Rusk asked whether the more than 60,000 United States soldiers buried in France were to be removed, de Gaulle simply stood up and left the room. Story 31. Julius Caesar died. At least he was surrounded by friends. Story 32. French surrender in World War II. Hitler dictates that the French capitulation take place at Compiègne, a forest north of Paris. This is the same spot where 22 years earlier the Germans had signed the armistice ending World War I. Hitler intends to disgrace the French and avenge the German defeat. To further deepen the humiliation, he orders that the signing ceremony take place in the same railroad car that hosted the earlier surrender. The armistice is signed on June 22nd. Under its terms, two-thirds of France is to be occupied by the Germans. The French army is to be disbanded. In addition, France must bear the cost of the German invasion. Story 33. The Battle of Alesia. Julius Caesar was attacking Gauls in what is now France. They took refuge in a fortified settlement on a hill. Caesar's army was not large enough to attack them directly, and the Gauls had reinforcements coming, so a simple siege was risky. Instead, Caesar built a larger ring of fortifications around the settlement, with 2 lines of walls back to back. His defenses included spiked pits and both earthen and wooden walls. The Gallic reinforcements could not break through, and the besieged could not communicate effectively with forces outside to coordinate an attack. Both Gallic armies were defeated when they attacked these fortifications, and Caesar emerged victorious. It is probably my favorite battle of all time. Story 34. Andrew Jackson was walking around Washington, District of Columbia, when an assassin tried to kill him with 2 pistols. Both pistols misfired, and Jackson proceeded to beat the would-be killer within an inch of his life with his cane. Story 35. The Danes attacked and raided Ethelred after he had just paid them not to. Story 36. The Siege of Tyre. Basically, Alexander the Great was unable to capture the city because it was on an island, so he turned it into a peninsula to be able to attack properly. It is said that Alexander was so enraged at the Tyrians' defense of their city and the loss of his men that he destroyed half the city. That was a pretty big fuck you to Tyre, and I love this comic representation of the events by Flork of Cows. Story 37. Genghis Khan to Shah Allah ad-Din. After the Khwarezmian forces plundered one of Genghis Khan's caravans, killed his people, and seized his goods, he chose a diplomatic approach and sent 2 envoys and an interpreter. Shah Allah ad-Din responded foolishly. He shaved the envoys' heads to shame them and sent them back with the head of the interpreter. Genghis Khan was enraged. He marched 200,000 men and annihilated their town. Only 1/4 of the defenders were able to fight back. He diverted the rivers that sustained the surrounding villages, intending to wipe Allah ad-Din's birthplace from the map so that it would be deserted and his enemy forgotten. Not even the dogs or cats would be spared, declared Genghis Khan. Story 38. Operation Paul Bunyan. Summary. In 1976, American personnel at the Korean Demilitarized Zone were cutting down a tree that obscured their view of the North Korean side. A pair of North Korean soldiers emerged and killed 2 American officers with the axe they were using. The United States and South Korea responded with an overwhelming show of force. Strategic bombers, jet fighters, 27 helicopters, a full aircraft carrier deployed off the coast, thousands of troops, armored personnel carriers, and commandos. All of it served to protect a squad of Army engineers who returned with chainsaws to finish cutting down the tree. The forces used are detailed in the Wikipedia article. The scale of the response is striking. Story 39. Alexander the Great cut the Gordian knot instead of untying it. Story 40. The Achaemenid Empire had trouble conquering Egypt in the early part of its campaign, so it used the Egyptians' sacred animals against them. Soldiers carried cats and painted cat heads on their shields so the Egyptians would be reluctant to fight and would surrender. This event is known as the Battle of Pelusium. Story 41. When Alcibiades slept with the Spartan king's wife, fled to Persia, became a high-ranking commander, and returned to Athens, where he had begun his political career and resumed it, he betrayed Athens, Sparta, and Persia and got away with it because he was so handsome. Story 42. I will always think of a story about Andrew Jackson that a history professor told me. Jackson married a woman who was divorced, which was already scandalous, but she was not actually divorced from her previous husband. Whenever Jackson heard people speaking ill of him or his wife, he would challenge them to a duel, a contest in which they took 10 paces and fired. One day he heard about a man who was an expert marksman and who was insulting him, so Jackson challenged him because he would duel anyone. When the duel began, they fired and Jackson dropped his pistol because he knew he lacked his opponent's skill. The other man fired and missed. Jackson picked up his pistol, walked up to his opponent, and shot him in the forehead. The only thing I remember from that class is this story. Story 43. Finns called petrol bottles Molotov cocktails after Molotov claimed the bombers over Finland were dropping bread baskets. In reality, they were dropping bombs, so Finns gave their improvised incendiary devices the sarcastic name Molotov cocktail to mock that claim. Story 44. In 1941, the United States requested that Panama grant a 999-year lease to build more than 100 military bases in Panama. The Panamanian government asked for compensation, which the United States considered too high. The United States responded by overthrowing the Panamanian government in a coup and then signed an agreement with the new government. Story 45. Prussian siege of Paris 1870 to 1871. Prussian forces besieged Paris for several months, occupying a series of forts and outposts around the city. The people assumed they were outside the range of Prussian artillery. After a few months of starving the city, the Prussian guns opened fire. They fired only at night and deliberately targeted landmarks. Residents had been hungry but believed they were safe. Then the Prussians announced that they were within range, and by daylight a monument or a church was often destroyed. This had a profound psychological effect. Story 46. My favorite example is when Deng Xiaoping ordered the People's Liberation Army to invade Vietnam to teach them a lesson about the South China Sea dispute. The Chinese advanced across the border expecting little resistance and reportedly wondered where the Vietnamese forces were, thinking they had not even fielded an army. Instead, they began suffering guerrilla attacks. Chinese communist forces were expected to easily defeat Vietnam, but they incurred far more casualties than anticipated. After about 1 month, they retreated back to China and declared victory. They could not deliver a decisive blow to the Vietnamese army. Story 47. The Battle of Cowpens took place during the Revolutionary War. A United States commander was given a large number of militiamen who in battle were known to fall back before being given orders. The British, knowing that Continental regulars would stand their ground while the militia would not, often pressed attacks to bring their numbers and weapons to bear. The commander decided to make a stand at a place where his force could not retreat, at a location called Cowpens. He chose a position on a small peninsula surrounded by a river that could not be easily crossed under fire. Once situated, the commander set his troops in 3 lines, the militiamen in front to fire first, more experienced soldiers in the second line to fire next, and hardened veterans in the third rank. When the British attacked, they tried several times to dislodge the colonial force, but they were repulsed each time. The commander explicitly ordered his troops to overcome their fear of the British, and the plan worked. Story 48. During the conquest of Constantinople, now Istanbul, Sultan Mehmed had his ships hauled over greased logs by thousands of men to bypass the great chain that blocked ships from entering the Bosphorus. Story 49. What England did to Joan of Arc. Henry V had made major gains in France in the 100 Years' War and had reached an agreement with the French king that, when he died, Henry would be his heir. Then Henry died of dysentery. Because the heir to the English throne was an infant, command of the war fell to the dukes. After a few years, they laid siege to Orleans. The siege lasted months. Enter Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who could barely write her name, who convinced the French commander to give her a chance because she said God was with her. She lifted the siege within 2 weeks. She went from victory to victory, depriving the English of the initiative and turning the war in France's favor. England was embarrassed by repeated defeats and wanted to stop her. She was captured after about a year and handed over to the English. Up to that point, the English had been portraying her as a witch or devil worshipper, and they wanted to try her for heresy to make a public spectacle and embarrass the French. Every church official at the trial was English despite Joan's protestations. The trial was loaded with traps designed to force her into self-incrimination, but she avoided almost everyone. One memorable exchange asked if she was in the grace of God. Saying no would admit guilt. Saying yes would be heretical because church doctrine held that you cannot be certain of your own state of grace. She answered, "If I am, may I be kept there, and if not, may I be guided there." The English bishop presiding over the trial was under great pressure to obtain a conviction. The case eventually focused on cross-dressing. Joan had been wearing a shirt and trousers in prison to discourage guards from assaulting her. Since a dress can be lifted up while a shirt and trousers are harder to remove without leaving evidence, She had appeared before the clergy in a dress, then returned to male clothing in prison. The court argued that cross-dressing was heretical and that she had relapsed, a crime punishable by death. She was burned at the stake, her bones ground to prevent relics, and the ashes thrown into a river. Decades later, the Pope ordered a retrial that exonerated her, and she was later declared a saint, but that did not undo what had been done. England ultimately lost most of its territories in France, so her military efforts were successful in the long term. Story 50. Quick rundown. Not a true fuck you moment, but I find her story great. Her husband died fighting in World War II, so she sold everything to buy a T-34 and be its driver and mechanic. She maneuvered her tank into positions that made fighting her unit a living hell for German forces, and she repaired her tank minutes after the Germans damaged it in the middle of combat. Story 51. This was the opposite of what you might expect. It could have been a severe rebuke, but it went another way. Abraham Lincoln, then a largely unknown frontier lawyer, was asked to assist in a law case by powerful Eastern lawyers because the trial was to be held in Springfield, and they wanted a local lawyer on the team. The location of the trial was later moved, but the Eastern lawyers never told Lincoln they no longer needed him. He worked hard on arguments and showed up to the trial, which was then in another state. The Eastern lawyers were rude to him, did not use his arguments, and did not allow him to participate. They eventually sent him a check for payment, which he returned. When Lincoln became president, he appointed the head lawyer of the Eastern Group, Edwin Stanton, as his Secretary of War. Stanton grew to admire Lincoln and proved to be a very effective Secretary of War. Lincoln could have remembered the earlier snub and refused to work with Stanton, but he was not offended and saw Stanton as a good choice for his cabinet. Story 52. Mary, Queen of Scots, wore a wig to her execution so that when the executioner tried to hold up her head to show the onlookers, he would be left holding only a handful of the wig. Story 53. Germany and France have a long history of confrontations. In 1871, Germany won the Franco-Prussian War and captured Paris. Prussian leaders used the victory to unify the German states into a Prussian-controlled Reich. The German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, making Germany a formidable European power reminiscent of the Holy Roman Empire. At the end of the First World War, Germany signed the Armistice of Compiègne on November 11, 1918, in a railway carriage in Compiègne, ending hostilities. The following year, the Allies, led by a resentful France, imposed the Treaty of Versailles, signed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles in 1919. France regained Alsace-Lorraine, which it had lost in 1871, and the Hall of Mirrors became associated with German humiliation. When Nazi Germany invaded France in 1940, Adolf Hitler had the French sign their surrender in the same railway carriage used in 1918. The carriage was displayed in Germany and was later destroyed when Soviet forces captured Berlin. Story 54. The 1898 Philippine Declaration of Independence was not genuine. The United States essentially purchased the territory from Spain and then governed it in its own way, preventing true independence. Story 55. I'm well done on this side. Turn me over. St. Lawrence. Story 56. Khosrow I Anushirvan was Shah of Iran in the 500s Common Era. He captured Antioch, then part of the Byzantine Empire ruled by Emperor Justinian. Before burning the city, he had architects and other specialists survey and record exactly what the city and its buildings looked like. He then rebuilt the town to match the original and named it We Antioch Khosrow, which roughly translates to Khosrow's Antioch. This was only one of the confrontations between Khosrow and Justinian. More details are covered in the extra credit series on this period. Story 57. Legendary samurai Miyamoto Musashi, undefeated in about 60 duels and having fought in 3 battles, was challenged to a duel. The duel was to take place on an island, and he knew his opponent would be using a longer-than-average blade, possibly an odachi. Being self-assured, he accepted the duel, rowed to the island, and beat his opponent to death with the boat or he had used to row there, because he knew it was longer than his opponent's blade by just a few inches. His opponent wanted to prove himself by using a longer blade, so one could say Musashi literally killed a man in a contest of ego. Forgive the grammar and formatting. Predictive text gave me a hard time. Story 58. Upon receiving his certificate as the first black doctor of philosophy in Harvard history, William Edward Burghardt Dubois allegedly remarked that the honor, I assure you, was all Harvard's. Story 59. Caesar at Alesia. The Gauls said, "Send the women and children. They will become slaves, but they will not die of starvation." Caesar replied, "Fuck you. Go back and die." Story 60. Not a historian, but this is one of my favorites. On December 22nd, German couriers approached American lines under a flag of truce, carrying a message from the German commander to the American commander. Asserting that Bastogne was encircled, the note gave McAuliffe, who was acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division in the absence of Major General Maxwell Taylor, 2 hours to surrender or face total annihilation. It offered the privileges of the Geneva Convention to the would-be prisoners of war. What came next would be one of World War II's seminal moments. To the German commander, nuts, from the American commander. Story 61. England named the train station that connects to France Waterloo. Story 62. The Battle of Stalingrad. The German commander Friedrich Paulus wanted to surrender to the Soviets. He had no food and was trapped. He called Hitler to ask for permission to surrender, and Hitler refused. Hitler promoted him to field marshal to prevent surrender. This was intended as an insult, because in Prussian and German tradition no field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler essentially told him to either die as a field marshal or live as a disgrace to Germany. Despite this, Paulus surrendered and later became a committed communist who cooperated with the Soviets while in captivity. Story 63. I like to share this story because it is full of explicit insults. Alboin, king of the Lombards during the early Middle Ages, killed a rival king on the Italian peninsula. He decapitated the man and had his skull turned into a drinking cup. When Alboin partied hard, he drank from the cup. He forced the other king's daughter to marry him after killing her father, and as a mean drunk sometimes made his new wife drink from her father's skull. His wife took a lover, and together they assassinated Alboin. Carthago delenda est was another notable defiant statement. Story 64. Genghis Khan hurled plague-ridden corpses over his enemies' walls. Story 65. King Olaf Tryggvason killed a Viking chieftain who refused Christianity by forcing a tube down his throat, pushing a snake into the tube, and lighting the end on fire so the snake tunneled out of the man's back. The victim was Raud the Strong. Story 66. Winter War between Finland, population approximately 3 million, and the Soviet Union, population approximately 300 million. It lasted 105 days. Strength: Finland, 300,000 to 340,000 soldiers, 32 tanks, 114 aircraft. Strength: Soviet Union, 425,000 to 760,000 soldiers, 2,514 to 6,541 tanks, 3,880 aircraft. Casualties and losses: Finland, 25,904 dead or missing, 43,557 wounded, 800 to 1,100 captured, 20 to 30 tanks lost, 62 aircraft lost, 70,000 total casualties. Soviet Union, 126,875 to 167,976 dead or missing, 188,671 to 207,538 wounded or sick, including at least 61,506 sick or frostbitten, 5,572 captured, 1,200 to 3,543 tanks lost, 261 to 515 aircraft lost, 321,000 to 381,000 total casualties. Story 67. Sparta to Philip II. Philip told Sparta that if he marched into the city, he would raze the land, burn the crops, rape the women, and destroy the city. Sparta replied with a single word: if. Story 68. When France surrendered in World War II, Hitler expected Britain to surrender. The next day, the Royal Navy sailed to North Africa and attacked the French fleet to prevent Germany from seizing it. Story 69. Right after the Sengoku Jidai, Japan invaded Korea because Korea would not allow Japanese forces to march through its territory to attack China. At first, the Japanese managed to land an invasion force because the Korean admiral would not attack unarmed transports despite having a vastly superior navy. After the invasion landed, that admiral was fired. He was replaced by Admiral Lee Sun-sin, known for being repeatedly mistreated by his government despite being effective and incorruptible. Lee Sun-sin then proceeded to destroy the Japanese navy with 3 turtle ships and about 30 other ships. After the land invasion, Ye's province was the only one left unconquered, so he turned it into a production hub and rebuilt the Korean navy. Later, a Japanese commander sent the Korean government a letter claiming there was an unarmed convoy in the area. The Koreans ordered Yi to attack, but he refused, saying it was an obvious trap. The Koreans then replaced him with a less competent admiral. When the Japanese used the same trick, almost the entire Korean navy was destroyed. Yi was reinstated as admiral of a navy of fewer than 50 ships to face a fleet of 300 ships. He defeated that fleet by choosing a narrow strait known for unpredictable currents, ideal for a small fleet but disastrous for a large one. The last battle Yi fought was alongside Chinese forces. The Chinese commander charged into the fight without support, so Yi advanced to assist. When the battle began to turn in Yi's favor, a stray bullet struck him. His last words were for his nephews to wear his armor and command as he would. No one knew he had died until the battle was over. Story 70. Much of what Hannibal did was a bold act of defiance, such as crossing the Alps in winter and surrounding and defeating a larger Roman army at the Battle of Cannae. Story 71. At the Nuremberg fairgrounds, when you stand where Hitler delivered his fiery speeches, you look out and there is now an American football field. I think it changes seasonally. It was autumn when I last visited. All the National Socialist symbols were destroyed at once after the American forces invaded. Story 72. When Grandpa Joe stood up after 20 years of faking it, it was only to take a tour of a chocolate factory. Story 73. The Affair of the Sausages. In 1522, Huldrych Zwingli and his reformers protested the church and its rules about Lent by eating sausages together. This event is considered the start of the Swiss Reformation. Zwingli, sometimes called the Swiss Martin Luther, encouraged the behavior as a defiant gesture toward the Catholic Church. He preached widely about it, and during that Lenten season he and his followers became known for eating sausages in protest. It is an important episode in church history. Story 74. Minnesota, 1862. The Dakota had signed treaties that ceded their ancestral land, including hunting and fishing grounds, in exchange for a reservation, annuity payments, food, and other goods. During the Civil War, the government delayed those payments, and the white traders employed by the government to disburse the annuities had little sympathy for the Dakota. The people were starving, and the traders refused to sell food to them on credit. One trader, Andrew Jackson Myrick, responded to a request for food by saying, "If they are hungry, let them eat grass or their own excrement." Shortly afterward, some of the younger Dakota men began an uprising against the traders, the government, and settlers who lived on their ancestral land. The Dakota uprising spread and many people were killed. Andrew Jackson Myrick was killed by Dakota warriors during a battle. When they came to clear the battlefield, they found him with his mouth and anus stuffed with grass. Story 75. The Union forces were set to march through Atlanta. The mayor of Atlanta wrote to General Sherman asking him to avoid unnecessary destruction. Sherman replied, "You might as well appeal against the thunderstorm as against these terrible hardships of war." He then marched through and destroyed Atlanta. Story 76. My favorite is the simplified humorous description of the French attempt to defeat Russia. French demand, "We have captured your capital. Surrender immediately." Russian response, "No." French reply, "But we have already captured your capital." Russian response, "Too bad." Story 77. I'd say burying all the Union soldiers on Robert E. Lee's property. Story 78. Construction of the Lion's Mound Monument in Waterloo followed Napoleon's defeat at the hands of the Allies. The giant statue appears to turn its back toward England and face France. Story 79. If we get into your city, we will burn it to the ground. Story 80. Olga of Kiev. The Drevians sent 20 of their best men to persuade Olga to marry the man who symbolized her husband's murder. She told them to wait in their boat, had a ditch dug, and the next morning had the emissaries buried alive. She then sent word to Prince Mal that she would accept his proposal only if the Drevians sent some of their leaders to accompany her back to their territory, so the proud Kievan Rus could see how important the match was. His party obliged, sending a group of chieftains to fetch her. She invited the visitors to wash in her bathhouse, locked the doors, and burned the entire party alive. Olga announced she would soon arrive at the Drevian capital Iskorostan and asked them to prepare a funeral feast to mourn her husband's death. Despite not having received word from the missions they had sent to Olga's court, the Drevians prepared the feast. After drinking themselves senseless on mead, Olga's soldiers slaughtered 5,000 of them. Olga then gave each soldier a pigeon or a sparrow and ordered them to attach to each bird a piece of sulfur bound with cloth. At night, she ordered the birds released. The pigeons returned to their dovecots and the sparrows to the eaves. The dovecots, coops, porches, and haymows caught fire. Summary. She had 20 Drevian envoys buried alive, burned a visiting party, killed 5,000 at a funeral feast, and set fire to the rest of their homes. Story 81. On November 2, 1932, Australia declared war on the emus. Emus were considered a nuisance to farmers, and the Australian government stepped in to control the population. They enlisted the help of the military and armed civilians to try to kill the emus. Emus, though fast and fierce creatures, did not take kindly to attempts on their lives and fled faster than the military could pursue them. The officer in charge of the operation, Major Meredith, said, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. They are like Zulus, whom even dum-dum bullets could not stop." The Australian government gave up on the effort and left population control to the farmers. In the end, the emus effectively prevailed. In summary, Australia declared war on the emus and lost. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.